Not study econ at the London School of Economics. I was not an econ
hmm
person. I came to this through the back door. I studied Latin American
hmm
politics. I wanted to be a Latin America journalist, and I graduated uh, at the peak of the financial crisis. Journalism jobs in England are really great creative collaborations with faculty, especially junior faculty. It's been
hmm
wonderful. And then we do one-off contracts, the same. And so I took over production for his investment publication. I was in Latin America for 5 years.
Hey, welcome back to Economics with Dr. A. I'm your host, Dr. Abdullah Al Bahrani, Associate Professor of Economics at the Hale College of Business. And on this channel, we talk about economics and business concepts to help you understand how the world works. Today's episode is with Samantha Eyler-Driscoll. And this is a fantastic episode for anybody that's interested in the field of economics but does not want to do a PhD in economics. Samantha lays down her path and how she is a contributing member in economic research and helping spread economic thought through her work. Samantha is the founder of Standard Error Editorial Services, and today we'll talk about entrepreneurship, economics, and her views on the profession. So make sure to stay tuned, leave a comment, and if you're new here, subscribe for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, I'm really excited to meet with you and get to know more about you and all the work that you're doing in economics and editing as well, and to learn about what your influence on the world is. So thank you for being here. I will get us kicked off with the first question, and it's a simple question. Tell us about yourself.
Oh, uh, I am an academic editor. I have worked in academic publishing in different capacities since I graduated with my master's in 2009. And
Mhm.
I started in the Center for Economic Policy Research in London,
Yeah.
and have made a few pit stops along the way. And now I have my own company um, called Standard Error Research Editors, and
hmm
we offer editorial support to economics departments, but also other social science departments, primarily economics departments, and individual researchers around the world. Sort of grew
Yeah.
out of my editorial practice, so it's very exciting, but it's
Well,
very new.
yeah, and I love your background because it's very different than the typical person that comes on this channel. And our students, my students that I mentor, really need to see the diverse paths that economic students take and people that are interested in economics. So give us a little background. I see London School of Economics. You just mentioned London. What was and you're Kentuckian, right?
So I did my undergrad in Kentucky, at
Okay, we're at
Kentucky Wesleyan. I had a
really
scholarship. My
okay.
mom said, "You're going where you get a scholarship," and I went there. So
Okay,
I'm
nice.
from Maryland, and I grew up in Kentucky and Wyoming.
hmm
Uh,
Oh, nice.
yeah, I was 5 years in Wyoming, and then I think 7 years in Kentucky before I went to England. Um,
hmm
to do my graduate work. I did not study econ at the London School of Economics. I was not an econ
hmm
person. I came to this through the back door. I studied Latin American
hmm
politics. I wanted to be a Latin America journalist, and I graduated uh, at the peak of the financial crisis. Journalism jobs in England are always at a premium anyway, and I tried, interviewed for lots of things, and ended up in a job in the Center for Economic Policy Research where I was working on the discussion paper series and realized this is amazing. Like I love this. And
Yeah.
I like econ. I studied political science. Econ is much more systematic, I would say. And
hmm
just got this passion for reading the research very, very closely. Also felt that it could bring so much to my interest in politics, which is sort of prior to everything for me. Um,
hmm
and Center for Economic Policy Research is uh, like the NBER. It's the European version, basically, of
hmm
NBER. So I got this network of economists sort of overnight. I just found myself in this very vibrant network of people doing the most interesting research. I think at the time, like Piketty was one of our program directors, and I was corresponding with him,
Really?
once a week to get his approval. And then he later on went to become a phenomenon, and I
Yeah.
uh, that laid the groundwork for what's now been, I think, 14 years in
Mhm.
well, I was at CPR for a while. A friend of mine, this also has fed into me having my own startup. A friend of mine went to Colombia and started a publishing company. And he knew I'd studied Latin American politics, and he knew that I was an editor, and I was also ambitious, and I was in London, and you know how the labor market is in London. It's kind of, slow slog. And he was
Mhm.
like, come over, run production for us. And so I did. He had this investment publishing magazine called, for the mining sector. Uh, and so
Mm.
I took over production for his investment publication. I was in Latin America for 5 years, um, and
Wow.
then I had a child, and I
Mhm.
needed help with childcare and family.
Yes.
So I came back to the U.S. to a job in the University of Chicago, and I was working
Okay.
at Booth for at the Stigler Center,
Mhm.
for which is a political economy research institute. So it really fit nicely with my interests. Sort of, yeah. I've
I'm not,
lots of twists and turns, but it's been a long time, and now I'm doing my own thing.
but I love all the twists and turns. I always tell my students and my mentees that life is nonlinear and you got to find it. And the one common denominator, and I'm picking it up in your conversation, is passion towards something. And your passion towards Latin America. Can you tell me where that stems from?
So I mentioned that I lived in Wyoming in my sort
Mhm.
of formative preteen, early teens. Um, we were in a rural area. I grew up on a farm. My dad is a horse trainer, and I was sort of interacting with migrants' kids from a young age. And because we were in such an isolated environment, I was so fascinated by like the experience of these kids that I was interacting with, and so I learned Spanish. I was homeschooled for until I was 13, so I
Mhm.
started teaching myself Spanish from the time I was about 11, and I'm good with languages. I think that's sort of the through line of my whole career. And
Yeah.
learning Spanish like opened this world of the migrant experience in the U.S. Um, I and also I studied history, so Latin American history, Latin American politics during the period that I was doing my undergrad and graduate degree was so vibrant. I did some trips, political trips to build connections around Latin America. And I, when I graduated, all I wanted was to go there. I ended up in
Mhm.
economics by accident, but I really, really wanted to be in Latin America. So when the opportunity came, I thought, I'm just gonna go. Um, and it
Yeah.
turned out to be probably the most important thing about my life. My daughter was born in Colombia. We still spend multiple months of every year in Colombia, and having one leg in the U.S. and one leg in Latin America is crucial to sort of how I think about um, inclusion in economics, the importance of inclusion in economics, getting voices published, getting people into rooms that would not normally or that would have a harder time being there, um, and also it really informs my sense of responsibility, right? Because I think people's positionality feeds into everything that they do, that they think,
Mhm.
and their commitments. And I like try to bring that commitment that was developed from so many years living in Latin America uh, to my work every day. I think it's fundamental to the mission of Standard Air, and to my approach to the sort of to equity and economics, and helping um, tear down barriers in the publishing
Yeah.
process.
It, Thank you for the work that you do. I would like to peel the layers of what is it that you do today. You're an entrepreneur. You have your own editorial company. Um, Tell me about that work and what's the most exciting part about it?
I fundamentally um, I mean, I love to do the editorial work. Um,
Mm.
the difficult thing when you have a company is that you have a lot of other things that you also have to do, which I am now figuring out.
Yeah.
And we're building a team. I'm not a natural manager. I have been lucky to find people who are also excited about the project and really keen to help grow it with me. Every day is a challenge in that you're learning, you're learning how to, you're talking to accountants, you're talking to lawyers, you're talking to marketing people, you're,
Hmm.
trying to learn new things about human resources, how to deal with people for human resources, and also cultivate people's human capital. And while primarily my main interest is still doing the actual being as close as possible to the research, so I'm doing a lot of the work still myself. Um, so it's it's challenging. It's very exciting though. I'm enjoying it. I would say before I was just clacking away at manuscripts all day every day. It was great,
Hmm.
and I loved the interactions with the researchers. But starting a company brings a whole new set of challenges than you're just every day putting out fires, thinking on your feet. It's great.
Well, I have to do, give a shout out to the process because one of the things that we did pre-recording of this is we sent you a copy of our newsletter. And sorry, let me turn off my mail over here so I don't get notifications. So we sent you and your team a copy of the newsletter that was going to go out, and it came back edited and marked up, and we loved it. Antoine and I were reading over it, and we're like, this is such a great example of the work that you do, and it improved the newsletter drastically. So if anybody's here after reading the newsletter, it sounded much better than our normal work because of your editorial services. How big is your team?
So right now we have four academic editors who
Mhm.
are contracting with us, and a consulting editor who has just come on board, who is he will be running our blog and social media, uh, because it got to be too much for me to do.
Yeah.
And then we are contracting with marketers in Colombia. I'm sort of leveraging connections like that I built when I was a production editor, which has been really amazing because we just sort of hit the ground running with a team that I already knew from having worked production with them, and being able to tap into that their talent and the
Hmm.
the interacting with people that you've already worked with, just it smooths the process so much. So I think that was
Yeah.
part of the reason why we were able to sort of hit the ground running, because we've only been operating for 11 months and it's going brilliantly. I'm very excited. So
Okay. So you're look or building your client list. What's a typical client look like for Standard
we
Earth?
have uh, a few big institutional contracts, that
Hmm.
sort of the bulk of, or I would say 40% of our annual revenue flow. Um, and the department is the payer. The
Okay.
it can be the professors, PhD cohort, that usually the job market cohort will come to us, or in some cases, master students who are applying for PhDs will send us their application packs. We'll help hold their hands through that process. Professors who are writing grant applications, who are writing submissions, who are about to present, who want us to look over their presentations. The department just pays us for big blocks of availability, and we
Yeah.
just hold their hands and do whatever they want, more or less. Um, I love those relationships because there's a lot of space for really great creative collaborations with faculty, especially junior faculty. It's been
Hmm.
wonderful. And then we do one-off contracts, the same, but for individual
Hmm.
clients, and those are just by the hour.
Okay.
And that is subject to our availability to kind of tend to the demand, because we give
Hmm.
priority to the institutional clients. Um,
Yeah.
and in job market season, for example, it gets very busy. So
Yeah.
so the institutional customers are like very obviously very, very important. Uh, uh, but the sort of core of the business are these institutional partnerships.
This is such a valuable conversation. I want to ask you about who needs an editor, and I'll preface it with why I'm asking this question because for non-native speakers, me being one of them, um, we grew up going through the system thinking that seeking help might be cheating,
Oh,
right? And now we see it with AI, for
oh,
instance. But yet, everybody is using some sort of support
mm.
system. And what is your perceptions on the use of editors? And how do we convince people to utilize that resource?
That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about the cheating people considering that this would be a problem. I think everyone needs an editor. Unfortunately,
Hmm.
it has now shifted to where publications would pay the cost of the editor because the value that we add can sometimes be diffuse. Um, I think
Yeah.
for non-native speakers, it is like the value added is very high, so it's really worth it to them. But everyone needs an editor. Everyone needs
Hmm.
someone who can closely read their work and also brings a lot of, I mean, even you know uh people who are not trained in diagramming sentences and um
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a spelling bee winner, right? I had a spelling bee coach all through high school. I'm
Yeah.
like people editors. Our job is to sort of bring expertise to language that the average writer, even native speaking writer, doesn't have, and also
Yeah.
to um, just be a second set of eyes, and to bring our knowledge of the field into interaction with the paper to make it better. So that is the value added that we bring for everyone. For non-native speakers, it's just that much more because it's
Yeah.
very I think it's enormously challenging to do technical writing at all. And for non-native speakers, it helps them have confidence that they're I have someone the other day was asking me about a paper, and she speaks excellent English. You would never ever notice, but just the small difference between subjunctive mood and indicative mood, um, uh, how it changes the meaning of a sentence. A non-specialist is
Hmm.
not going to realize that that's happening. Um,
Yeah.
and so that's just a very basic sort of small example. Um, but the reason that I think the institutional model is valuable is because it does sort of it is closer to the editorial model that papers and other publications have used up
Hmm.
until recently, where media, like in general, people don't want to pay editors just because everybody's under resourced. So
Yeah.
we're attentive, I would say. That's our individual contracts are priced very close, like at marginal cost, more or less.
Hmm.
We charge in like 10-minute increments, literally, on institutional
Yeah.
contracts to keep the price accessible to people who really, really need the service, and we try to target the service at people who are going to see high value added. Um, from it. So, and for the feedback that I get from my customers is just that, this is essential. Like, so.
Yeah. Well, I'll throw out there that I use an editor. I believe in the power of editing. The way I compare it is to going to the
Mm.
gym, right? I could probably figure out a workout routine myself, but there's an expert that can guide me through the process in a better and more efficient way. So my dissertation, and actually, I'll tell you my experience. I For my dissertation in 2009, I got the first editor, and the first editor did not know
Okay.
economics, and that was probably the worst mistake I ever made. And then my second editor, knew enough about the subject matter to know the language that we use, and it was night and day the experience. So, what do you think about what I just said?
That is our selling point. at Standard Air,
Hmm.
essentially, that sets us apart from people like my previous employers, American Journal Experts, for
Yeah.
example. It's a very coarse match on uh, area of study expertise, and people come back very unhappy.
Hmm.
and I think the company, a big multinational like Springer, um, at the moment they are more focused on investing in tech, AI, LLMs, things like this, than in cultivating sort of the human capital of the editors, which is, a
Hmm.
big bet, would be a big bet on their part in any case, because the editors can just walk away with that. But there is, for this reason, I think, amongst like the big sort of factory editing, academic editing outfits, a big problem of low
Yeah.
expertise and like very coarse match. In our case, that is what we're trying. That's the problem that we're trying to solve. And in fact, Standard Error was born because uh, economists who I know and who from my network and who know the sort of work that I do and the level of quality that we can offer, they approached us and asked us to take
Hmm.
like do like an institutional agreement that I was not going to be able to do with, my other job. So the company naturally
Yeah.
grew out of this problem that you're talking about. And that
Hmm.
is why we say we offer disciplinary and editorial expertise. And that is sort of a key component of, the training that now I'm doing with our editors, because
Hmm.
most of them are also coming from political science. I would say, like, I think
Yeah.
the incentives are not strong for someone with an econ PhD to become an editor. Let's just say that you can go
Hmm.
and become a data scientist at Amazon, and so it's not super easy to recruit trained economists to become economics editors. But political scientists, the job market for political science is not that great. So
Yeah. Yeah. So what's your day to day? I know you said being an entrepreneur and leading the team is you're putting out a lot of fires, but what's a typical day in your life, if there's such one?
I try to schedule at least three manuscripts for myself every week.
Hmm.
Um, there are still some manuscripts that I, want to make sure they're to give they're getting the very best. So I try to uh, isolate time, big blocks of time for these big manuscripts. And sometimes, econ manuscripts are increasingly ridiculously long, 20,000 words, something
Yeah.
like that. So it can be, big projects like this can become very time consuming, but I sort of have to like put boundaries around that time so that I can give it my whole focus. And the rest of the time is scheduling team meetings, going to
Hmm.
conferences, talking to the marketers, brainstorming content with our consulting editor for the blog, um, trying to file taxes, which is
Yeah.
not fun, and doing all the things that you need to do, which turns out that there's a lot. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll make sure to do our part and help market your work. So we'll get all the links and put them in the description of the podcast and the video. Um, One thing that you talked about earlier was helping unheard voices become heard, and that meant a lot to me. But I want to start to peel the layers on that one. Can you tell me some of the work that you're doing to help develop the pipeline of economists or academics in general, and why are you feeling pulled to do that work?
We have a series on our blog that is sort of nascent, called Talk at the Top. The introduction to the series talks about uh, you need to learn how to talk you need to learn how to talk like an economist. There is a phenomenon
Mhm.
called elite closure, where
Hmm.
uh, people in small social groups, hierarchical elite social groups, develop shared norms, shared tropes, conventions, ways of talking, vocabularies, lexicons, um, things that you will acquire by attending conferences, by reading economics papers for 14 years. These this is the sort of institutional knowledge that I try to bring to the problem of very poor representation in economics,
Hmm.
uh, to try to help get people in into rooms that would be very hard for them to get into. Uh, I was at the IEA World Congress in December. For the first since before the pandemic, Danny Roderick was handing over to Elhanan Helpman. I was so impressed by the leadership, like Danny Roderick's leadership, and I get the sense that he brings like his Turkish identity and his sense that, global South countries have been sidelined. And to see the way that the way that he led that conference and really made a space for issues that are of concern to global South countries. And he chaired himself a panel on feminist economics,
Hmm.
that was a wonderful panel full of like very critical economist voices, uh, making like explicit critiques of patriarchy, things that you would never generally think that you would see. And
Hmm.
it really reaffirmed my sense that, a leader with the right values in at the helm of institutions can do so much. And I wanna, I sort of wanna help people along, right? Like we
Hmm.
wanna do, I think a lot of people don't have, people coming from developing countries, have, in many cases, aren't going to have spent a decade, reading manuscripts. They're certainly not going to have the facility of language in a lot of cases to feel confident that they can replicate that themselves. And so I kind of, I think it is, I think I mentioned before, politics is prior to everything for me. What my
Hmm.
sense of citizenship, my sense of political commitment sort of forged, as I mentioned, just like growing up right next to these marginalized communities, and like trying to participate in some way, and just like communicating across this boundary, um, that today informs what we're trying to do. And
Hmm.
we don't pick and choose based on people's politics. We will work with anyone.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the nature of the work, the character of it, is most impactful for people who are furthest, or, sort of furthest from the core.
Yeah.
And so we uh, do that that's what we're trying to do. And we try to, which,
Hmm.
we try to keep pricing at a place that's accessible as well, to be able
Yeah.
to make these services accessible. So
Thank you for doing that work and recognizing the importance of making the voices heard. What one What's missing right now other than the work? So I'm continuously asking, and Antoine, Fred, and the rest of our research lab, we're asking about the ingredients that are needed to create a culture where people excel and we're being inclusive and opening doors in the profession right now. What ingredients are missing, or you could think of it in a more positive way if you want to look at it as half full. What ingredients are there for us to utilize and improve the outcomes?
that's a good question. uh, I think economics is particularly a particularly difficult discipline, to deal with the problem of inclusion, because that problem is fundamentally political, right? Econ
Hmm.
does its very best to sort of depoliticize itself, because it to enhance its own credibility, I would say, in its own usefulness to the policymaking process. Uh, so a feminist critique is a political critique. Feminist economists are making a sort of counter hegemonic critique. When you're
Hmm.
working with the state and you're trying to influence the policymaking process every day, counter hegemonic critiques are not always welcome in the room. so,
Yeah.
so it's hard. And I think econ, particularly because it is the social science that is closest to the policymaking process, suffers the most. There are a lot of other reasons I would say, but that is my assessment of why this is such a difficult problem. Um, and so people like me who are sort of not economists on the margins, we have a little bit more space to talk about that, you know.
Mm.
um and I think econ podcasts, for example, are also a very good sort of forum in which to talk about things like this. um
Hmm.
and I would say that it maybe an ingredient that is just to leverage these spaces on the fringes, you know.
Yeah.
uh, Conferences in developing countries where that people
Mm.
can talk. I mean, people when I was at the IAA meeting, people were saying like this: we would not have this sort of keynotes, we would not have this sort of conversations if this was being held at Harvard. Um,
Yeah.
so leverage the fringes, leverage those sort of more marginal spaces to build relationships. I think that that's very, very important, and to cultivate knowledge and get people with a strong sense of commitment and strong values into the right rooms.
So this your conversation reminded me in 2019, 2020, I was doing my sabbatical right when COVID happened in Dublin, Ireland.
Okay.
And one of the conversations that was a popular conversation pre-COVID that I had never thought of, and I'm an international student, but I still hadn't thought about it. How many of my colleagues, economists from other parts of the world, can never attend a conference in the United States because of our visa, um, restrictions here? And it made me realize how many voices I was missing at conferences. And something as simple as conferences, changing, locations, countries from time to time would open up that space for other voices to be heard because visa policies are restrictive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So our research lab, and I'm proud of this, is 50% female. And this episode is going to air during Women's History Month. And we are continuously asking ourselves, how do I do a better job mentoring, women economists in this field? I do recognize that, I don't. I'm a male. I identify as male Arab, um, and there's some things that I will just never see, but I want to understand. What is the struggle today, from your perspective, or what are the needs for us to improve the profession for women economists?
I, I strongly believe that women just need more power, right? They
Hmm.
maybe don't not. I think any amount of understanding from well-intentioned people is
Yeah.
fundamentally. I mean, you're not the problem, right?
Hmm.
And so I think just standing with women is
Hmm.
important. I think
Yeah.
making space for them in at tables, and often literally at tables. If they're in a conference and they need some place to sit down at the lunch or whatever,
Hmm.
like give them a spot beside you. But there's no I don't think there's any kind of silver bullet in terms of overnight fixing the sort of
Yeah.
problems with misogyny. And I mean, we all know how terrible EJMR has it is used, for example,
Yes.
to coordinate harassment campaigns. And people really often, I think, are uh, very naive about the way that
Hmm.
harassment campaigns, and also like racist harassment campaigns, like we've
Yeah.
seen with Lisa Cook and various other like episodes that I can think of. I think people are naive about the extent to which they'll just take the bait. They'll just take the bait. And so
Yeah.
solidarity is important. So I think the only tip that I would have is just, which
Mhm.
I guess as my own operating principle, I can't necessarily understand everything that people in other marginalized communities are facing, but when I see them in the line of fire, I
Mhm.
will put something on the line um, to try to stand with them. And I think people, when they also see you putting things on the line, um,
Mhm.
they'll come to you as well when they need help. So,
Yeah. You mentioned giving power. Um, how does that happen? Because you know, allies, quote unquote allies, sometimes feel like they're doing something, but they're not doing what they think they're doing, right? So, how do you support or how do you give power? You mentioned things as simple as pulling people into the table of the conversation, making their voice heard. Other tips that you might be willing to um, provide.
um, I had an economy, or I had a column at a feminist magazine for a while where I wrote a
Mhm.
column um, that was, I think the title was something like, "If you want to show a woman you respect her, fight with her," um, and I I think your people's willingness to fight with women um, is
Mhm.
a mark of their esteem, especially at the
Mhm.
top of the field, right? Um,
Yeah.
People often pull women onto editorial boards or teams or whatever to try to improve representation, but then when those women start talking, and
Mhm.
instead of just like showing up and like smiling, um, they start talking and
Yeah.
disagreeing, then everything falls apart. You have to be
Mhm.
willing to disagree. You have to be willing to
Mhm.
possibly lose.
Yeah.
And that I think like is the mark of um, a woman who has power, right? Like,
Yeah. We just had a conversation with Claudia Sam, and she talked about how everybody wants to increase diversity, but not enough people are focusing on inclusion. And that's something that your statement just made me think
mm.
of. What other organizations out there right now that are supporting um, young economists that you would like to highlight?
So the IEA has, for example, a Women in Economics initiative, um, where they have a platform and they have agreements with publications to uh, raise the voices of women economists in developing countries
Hmm.
specifically. Um, I think they're working with Vox EU, which is where I started my career, and Project
Yeah.
Syndicate, and they're seeking to get not only get these voices out there, but also to improve the economists' own confidence and experience in dealing with international
Mhm.
media, um, presenting themselves as sort of public intellectuals, which I think is really valuable. I really like that. Um, there are the like C-SWEP is I think doing reasonably good
Hmm.
work in the AEA.
Yeah.
I don't want to go like all white woman nation, like those are like those are sort of like our the classic like organizations that are supporting women in econ. um
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the work that C-SWEP is doing. So if anybody's listening and is interested in their efforts, highly recommend them. And Antoine and Fred, I'm going to pull you into this conversation. Do you have any questions for Samantha? All right, Samantha. Fred Small wanted to know because of your interest in Latin-speaking economies, if you are still affiliated or doing work for uh, uh, Latin-speaking literature or written work.
if we do translations,
Yes.
we we can do translations. I
Mhm.
learned from my long time at Springer, because they have a translation product. They that the economics of the translation are complicated. Uh,
Yeah.
I tried to sort of leverage what I'd learned about the market itself and price points and things like that, having been in a big multinational, when I started the company, to limit really our offering, just to
Hmm.
make sure that we're doing something that I know is viable. People do. I have worked as a translator in the past. Like when I was in Colombia, people would often ask me to translate things for them. And uh, so it's not that it's not possible. It's just that it's often, in the case of the payer, not very economical for them to do
Hmm.
so. And AI is increasingly good. So, and I think that for Springer, they have a product now where they'll offer AI translation that is edited by a native speaker, and that seems to
Hmm.
get the job more or less done. So yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Translation market is tough, and being an economist that some of my audience is in Arab speaking countries, seeing my work get translated loses sometimes it's easier to edit than to maintain
Yeah.
tone, especially when you're switching languages. And I found my work losing my tone, my identity, by it becoming more accessible to a different audience, which is a delicate balance. You want more people to read your work, but at the same time, you're like, it's not truly, doesn't sound like me
I mean,
anymore.
it feeds into the sort of the thing that I was talking about elite closure, and that like it's a
Hmm.
social language. These conventions are social, right? And so it's
Yeah.
not always easy to transport them across contexts. We do the best that we can.
Hmm. Antoine, did you have a question? I thought I saw you looking for your unmute button. Perfect. Antoine has a really amazing question, one that I probably need to know the answer to. Do you have any tips on how to improve or continue to work on your writing skills after college?
My biggest tip is to read a lot. That
Mhm.
seems facile, but it is how you learn how people are talking in the spaces that you want to be writing. So that is what I also like. What our editors, when we're training them, we need them to be reading constantly the financial press, new papers. Also learning how people use languages by going to seminars and things like this. But I would say the best thing to make you a good writer is to read a lot.
That's really great advice. Samantha, I really appreciate you being on this podcast and making your time available to us. I know how busy you are, but your experience and your knowledge is something that I know. I already have several students that I'm going to send them this podcast because they're interested in economics, but they don't want to go the PhD route, and they've been told if you don't get a PhD in economics, then it's not worth it. But there's so many paths that you could influence the economics profession and the economics dialogue that's happening, and your experience is one of those. So thank you for making your voice heard on this podcast, and we really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I will be very excited to talk to your students and anyone else who
Perfect.
wants to come around.
We'll make sure to invite you back to Kentucky for a
Oh,
visit.
okay.